Well, hello. I want to welcome you once again to our Bible Fellowship series as we continue on our YouTube channel. We are in the last lesson of our series on spiritual disciplines, this whole idea of what it really means to grow in our faith and to develop and intensify that intimacy that we have with the Lord. And we've looked at a lot of different aspects of that, but we're going to finish with this idea that really sort of similar to last week when we talked about our role within the church. We're going to look this time about specifically what it means to, as this lesson is called, join in God's work, to do the things that we're called to do. And I would, as an opening statement to that whole idea, I would emphasize this point that one of the purposes of spiritual discipline is to increase our resemblance to God, to grow in godliness, to put into practice those things that we know that we need to be doing. And as we looked at last week, those things benefit the church and it's mutually beneficial to all of us that are involved. But the foundational aspect of that is the fact that as spiritual beings, as people who are in a spiritual relationship with God, we are intimately connected with the Lord himself. And so we're going to be looking at John chapter 15, a few verses out of that book today that really talk about this idea and illustrate for us the idea that we are so connected to the Lord. And really spiritual growth, spiritual disciplines, however you want to term those things, spiritual formation, all of those things are designed to, again, enhance that relationship. Not that we're going to be any more strongly connected. We're either going to be connected to the Father or not, one of those two. But the fact that we are connected, really our understanding of that and our connection comes from this idea that the work that he did in and through us is what enables us to do the things that he calls us to do. So hopefully we'll clear that up in just a second as we talk about what this really means. And again, I said we're going to be looking at John 15, starting in the first verse, and looking at a few of these things in John's gospel that really emphasize and illustrate this for us. So the first three verses of John's 15th chapter says this: I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Every branch in me that does not produce fruit, he removes, and he prunes back every branch that produces fruit so that it will produce more fruit. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. And so, we start this section with this idea of analogy where Jesus is the vine, vine that grows in a garden, and the Father is the gardener. So Jesus was the one that was sent to do the work that the Father wanted him to do. You and I, as people who are, again, connected with the Lord at a spiritual level, we are the branches that are on this vine. So that's just the analogy that's given. So the Father's the gardener, Jesus is the vine, and you and I are the branches. And so he's going to talk in these passages about this idea of bearing fruit, of being a plant that bears some kind of fruit. Doesn't matter what the fruit is. And we see that in nature. We see a gardener would tend a garden, that there would be vines that would be planted. Each of the vines would sprout these branches, and that's where the fruit comes from. And so we see in John's gospel, this is just one example of this, we see 7 I am statements. And while this isn't meant to be an in-depth study of John, it's important for us to understand these 7 I ams because they connect directly back to the I am that we see in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, when God said the best way to describe me or define me or to refer to me as I am that I am. That's an all-encompassing statement. So really, when we look at Jesus's declarations as recorded specifically in John's gospel, he repeatedly says this in different ways. I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I'm the gate, I'm the good shepherd, and so forth. And so in John 15, he's using another one of those analogies. And all of these are meant to reinforce this idea that Jesus and God are connected. In fact, they are the same. And so we can't skip past that. We need to understand that in this analogy, Jesus is not some sort of middleman. He really is the Father. He said himself, I and my Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But he's talking about in this function that we're setting up in this analogy, Jesus would be doing the work of the Father. You and I, as branches, then bearing fruit, would be doing the work that we're called to do. And so when we talk about this, we understand a couple of things. That first of all, the branch in this analogy, the branch never does decide to bear fruit. The branch just doesn't wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to bear fruit. I'm going to just be in the mood to bear fruit today, and other days I'm not going to be in the mood to bear fruit. What we see is a result of a connection, because the branch is connected to the vine, and that is a real connection. Then that work or the energy or the whatever's going to flow from the branch to the vine to the branch is then going to just very naturally produce fruit. And so that's an important concept for us, because sometimes we read through a passage like this and we might say some kind of a thing about maybe I need to bear more fruit, or we come under some conviction that we're not bearing any fruit. We need to understand the whole idea of this is not to keep score of how much fruit we're bearing. The whole idea is to say there is a natural bearing of fruit, and if there is no fruit, why not? We need to look back at this connection that we have. And so if we really are connected, if we really are part of this analogy, connected with Jesus, then the natural thing is that we will bear fruit. And so when we talk about fruit in the scriptures, there's a couple of different ways we could look at it. Sometimes when we talk about fruit, we're talking about something with an evangelistic bent. When we talk about witnessing and seeing people come to faith in Christ, that is often referred to as bearing fruit. And is that a part of bearing fruit, of being a follower of Christ? Well, absolutely. Sometimes we talk about bearing fruit in terms of acts of ministry, acts of service that we do in the name of the Lord. Is that considered bearing fruit? Well, certainly. We see biblical examples of that. And maybe more pertinent to this particular lesson on spiritual discipline and spiritual growth, we talk about fruit being personal growth, or that what we see in the New Testament is simply listed as the fruit of the Spirit, these traits, these inner qualities and things that are developed within us as our intimacy and our relationship with the Father grows. And so all three of those are valid aspects of bearing fruit. But all three of those are manifestations of this connection that we have with the vine, and that is with Jesus himself. And so that sort of sets the stage for what we're talking about here. So in John 15, 4-5, kind of look at this second idea. He starts by saying, remain in me and I in you. Just as a branch is unable to produce fruit by itself unless it remains on the vine, neither can you unless you remain, and there's that word again, remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him produces much fruit, because you can do nothing without me. So clearly, he emphasizes this word remain. You see it 3 times in those verses right there. So the word remain in the Greek literally means not to depart or to abide or to continue to be present. So it simply means I haven't left. On an ongoing basis, I'm going to stay put, stay right there, present in the moment, present in the circumstances and situation, and it's going to be translated. Oftentimes you see it translated as abide. That idea of abide is to dwell or to take up residence. And so it's this idea of not being disconnected, not coming and going as you want to and as you choose, but staying consistent and staying connected to, and connected to the very source. And so it would stand to reason that if we aren't connected to the vine, to Jesus, we're not going to bear any fruit. That should just be a common sense deal when we think about this analogy, that fruit is only going to come about when we are truly connected to the vine. It's interesting when we think about that if you really think about it in nature, have you ever seen the fruit that just grows right on the vine? Well, that doesn't happen. You don't see an apple tree with this trunk coming up and its big branches and then apples hanging off the branches. We see those smaller extensions, those smaller little branches and parts of what we would refer to, in this case, the vine or the tree trunk, the main source. We don't see the fruit growing right on the vine, but we see it growing on those branches and those extensions. And so that's an interesting component that God has chosen to work, to let us work in the power of Christ, through the power of the Holy Spirit, but carrying out the things that he wants us to do. And in that amazing setup, We only do what we can do when we are connected to God. And so it's really a beautiful analogy. But you can see John sort of takes a little break from this analogy when he's speaking to his disciples, and he actually gives this command. He says, you are to remain. Now, in nature, you don't have to command the branch to remain connected to the vine. It just is. It does it very naturally. But where John had to go in talking to you and I, and talking to, as Jesus was talking to his disciples, and John recorded those words, he was very aware that you and I have the conscious will. We have the opportunity to choose not to remain connected. And so it's important that even though branches don't have a will, people do, and we have to understand that. Again, that's part of spiritual maturity. That's part of us making that conscious effort as we grow, making that, coming to that understanding when maybe we're seeing less fruit, that we're not as strongly connected as we should be, that we need to be closer to the Father, that we need to remain in Him. And so we see this idea of really a little bit of hard work on our part. Now, this isn't salvation per se. We don't need to stay connected and stay saved, but this is an idea of us staying close to our power source, close to our source of nutrition, close to the source of the strength and the food that's going to keep us connected and doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. No branch just falls off a tree and is separated, or no branch falls off a vine and stays separated and then continues to produce fruit. It just doesn't happen. And so that's what he talks about in John 15 and closing in verses 6 and 8. He says, if anyone does not remain in me, and again, he doesn't need to command the branch to do this, but he has to command you and I to do this because we have the ability to choose. If anyone does not remain in me, to continue to be present, to choose not to depart, to abide or dwell. If anyone does not do these things, he is thrown aside like a branch and he withers. They gather them, throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you want and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples. And so again, as that kind of metaphor is carried out, we see the idea that if there is a break, if there is this separation and the branch does fall from the tree, not by its own choice, but maybe someone breaks it off, or maybe a storm comes up, or whatever the case may be, but the branch falls off, life immediately ceases. It begins to get brittle. It begins to get very stiff. It can be snapped in half, and it certainly doesn't produce any fruit. Any piece of fruit that would be on that branch when the branch falls off, the whole process the whole thing just withers up and dies. And John talks about, or Jesus talks about these words, that they become like sticks that you would gather for firewood. And if you know anything about trying to start a fire, you don't break a piece of a living wood, a branch or something off of a plant or a tree that's alive. That it's still got life in it, and it's green, and it doesn't burn, and it will probably make a lot of smoke. It doesn't make for a good fire. The best firewood is that stuff that's already dry, it's already dead, it's been off of the tree or the vine, it's been disconnected for a while, and death has taken place. Those are the things that gathered up and are burned. And so again, you don't have to tell that to a tree because the process is very natural, but it's a warning to you and I that we need to stay connected to remain connected. Now, there's the result of that is otherwise we'll end up being worthless, dead, and cast aside. And that's not where any of us would want to be. And those spiritual disciplines and that spiritual growth, that thing that we have to sometimes work hard to pursue and to keep at, we need to have in mind that if we don't do those things and we allow ourselves to sort of fade away and get disconnected from our power source or from the source of nutrition, we run the risk of being worthless and dead and being cast aside. I want to discuss just a little bit about some of the meanings of this sort of deal, this idea of being cast aside, like, chaff that blows in the wind or something like that. But it really is this idea of, what does it mean to be, I'm connected with the body, I'm connected with the vine, I'm part of this, and now I've been cast aside. Well, again, as I said before, this there's some interpretations that could be possibilities here. And one possibility could be that what Jesus is talking about was, you're part of the vine and you're part of the family, but if you don't measure up, and you don't produce enough fruit, you're going to be pruned, you're going to be broken off, and you're going to be tossed into the fire. And so people look at that as maybe a way to defend this idea that you could lose your salvation. Well, that's contrary to what we see in other parts of the scripture. So we can't interpret that passage that way because the scriptures are not ever inconsistent. Some people refer to this maybe in terms of rewards that you might be getting, and you're going to get less in terms of rewards when you get to heaven. But we don't see a lot of validity in that particular interpretation either. I would assert that the best way to interpret this is that there are people, if you look at Judas Iscariot as an example, people that look like they are part of the vine. They wear the T-shirt, they wear the "What Would Jesus Do" bracelet, they worship demonstrably in church, they claim to be a Christ follower, but they were never genuinely connected at the outset. And that's really what we want to be mindful of when we're talking about this. It's not so much the idea of, hey, I'm not bearing a lot of fruit, I better get back on the beam and start bearing fruit. It's really looking at this lack of fruit in our lives and saying, gosh, have I ever been connected at all? Because the scriptures teach, and nature teaches me, that if I truly am connected, I will bear fruit. Now, granted, we're all going to have our ups and downs, and we're all going to have times maybe when life comes at us hard and we get distracted from what we're doing. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about positionally. We're talking about this idea of consistently, I look at my life and I don't bear fruit, whether that's the fruit of growth internally in spiritual development, whether it is the fruit of evangelism, whether it's the fruit of service and ministry and understanding the reasons I'm doing those things. If those things aren't present in my life, this gives me a great opportunity to examine myself and say, why is that? And I just want to caution you that if you are wearing the T-shirt and the bracelet and acting like you are connected, but there's zero fruit, then there's something very unnatural in that relationship. Just as the tree produces these branches which produce fruit, it can't help but do that. If it doesn't, then that means there's some kind of disease or some kind of disconnect. And that's the same with you and I. If we're not producing fruit, we could be hanging around the tree, but we never have been grafted into that tree. We're not really ever going to produce the fruit. And that's really the caution for you and I. And really, when we're talking about spiritual disciplines, isn't that the goal? To be more intimately familiar with the Lord? And the very basis of that is salvation itself. We put the cart before the horse if we're out there trying to talk about spiritual disciplines and Bible intake and time spent in prayer, silence and solitude and meditating and all the other things we've covered, and even our role within the church that we looked at last week. But at the very basis of that, if we haven't been connected to the Father through Jesus, then we're never going to really genuinely produce fruit. And so it's an opportunity for us to really examine ourselves and to ask ourselves some hard questions, kind of piggybacking on what we talked about last week with accountability and lifting each other up in the church. There might be people within our church, or maybe even within your own family, that we have to sort of monitor and walk through some of those things with. And it may be that in an accountability relationship, you have the opportunity to even question somebody about their salvation. Not question their salvation, but ask them about their salvation. Find out if that ever was really a genuine experience. That's the most important thing that needs to be resolved. And so when Jesus is talking about this, he's talking about the whole idea so that the Father would be glorified, that you would produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples. And don't misunderstand, it's not you have to go out and produce a lot of fruit to prove that you are a disciple, but because you are producing fruit, there is the proof. It's a very natural thing. So it's not I have to do this. This is how it's just going to be if I really am a true disciple. So I want that to be an encouragement to you this week, but I also want it to be maybe a tad convicting. But really think through some of those things and ponder some of those things. And then, of course, there may be times when you've just allowed distractions or things to get in your way, and you're not tapping into that source with Jesus as much as you need to be. So yes, there is some element of that. that we are supposed to join in with God and join in with the church, and we need to be mindful that we're not letting things distract us from that. But again, if we are truly connected, it will come out. There will be fruit in our lives in one way or another. And so, but if there's a reason why that's not happening, and that reason can be traced back to a lack of a transformational, a radical experience with Jesus, then we need to understand that, and by all means, we need to get that addressed. And so, if that's where you are this week, I want to just invite you, give you that opportunity. Contact the church office, contact one of the pastors, and say, I'd just like to talk about this. Let me walk through this and see if we can get some issues resolved. Far better to get those questions answered, to get that issue hashed out and resolved on this side of eternity than on the other side of eternity. And so I want that to be an encouragement to you, as well as an admonition to really examine yourself. Well, thank you for tuning in. Like I said, this is the last lesson in our series, and we start a brand new session. It's going to be 7 weeks long. We'll start that next week, and we're starting to look at the essentials of Christianity. So we're going to be looking at some really core, basic things: the nature of God, the nature of sin, the work of the Holy Spirit, the return of Jesus. And so if you know somebody that really would like just an entry-level theology class, or if you just need to be refreshed on some of those things, which we all do, then I invite you to be part of what's going on over the next 7 weeks. And make sure you pass this information on. Even if you invite someone to Bible Fellowship or to tune in via Zoom and they just haven't been able to make that commitment or pull that trigger yet, then send them the YouTube link and let them watch some of these things that we're talking about through our Bible Fellowship curriculum over the next 7 weeks. And so this Sunday we wrap up that final lesson, and again talking about joining God's work. And so I hope that you're encouraged. I hope that you're blessed as we do that. Again, we're running full steam ahead in Bible Fellowship. Many classes doing the hybrid models, and a couple of them just doing Zoom alone. But whatever the case may be, we really want you to get plugged in with Bible Fellowship, get connected with a group here at Chahowee Hills, and one way or the other, we will see you as part of that. And then continuing to worship on Sunday mornings, online and in person. Wednesday night activities going full steam with our kids and our students in nursery. And so much going on. I just want to encourage you to, as you feel comfortable and when you can come back, be a part of it, because we are here for you, and we're joining in God's work, and we are the church moving forward. And so continue to pray and continue to examine your own heart, even as you look at this important idea of bearing fruit. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great day. God bless.